Welcome to yet another joint program of ASHA, that is Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, and Ganga Jamni, a joint series on our shared past and its sources of information. This time we have three programs instead of two lined up for you today, and then as usual on Sunday. But then we will follow it up on Monday with a special program on Women's Day. But on that later. Today we have Dr. Anirudh Deshpande, who is a professor at the Department of History, Delhi University. He teaches not only modern and early modern Indian history, but also European history. He is the author of a number of books, including The British Raj and its Indian Armed Forces 1857 to 1939, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2002. His second book was on British military policy in India 1900 to 1945, Colonial Constraints and Declining Power, which was published by Manohar in 2005. He is also the author of Class, Power and Consciousness in Indian Cinema and Television, published by Primus Books in 2009. His other books are, for example, The First Line of Defense, Glorious 50 Years of the Border Security Force by Shipra Publications, 2015. Hope and Despair, Mutiny, Rebellion, and Death in India, 1946, by Primus Books, which was published in 2016. And of course, the recently published and very interesting book, The Practice of History, Essays in Search of a New Past, which has been published just some time back, a few months back in 2020 by Akar Books. Incidentally, this is a book which I shall recommend to all those interested in history. All of you must read it. Apart from these, he has more than 70 academic papers, commentaries, reviews, and numerous articles since which he has written since 1987 and published in journals and newspapers like in IESHR, Studies in History, EPW, Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, Contemporary India, Book Review, Biblio, Mainstream, and papers like Hindustan Times, Telegraph, Tribune, Pioneer, and even Amar Ujala. He is also a regular commentator on India's only bilingual journal, Forward Press, dedicated to social justice. A commentary on treating the visual as an archive was published in EPW in December 2018, which marked the 26th year of his consistent publication in that prestigious journal. He has a reviewed entry, The Wars of the English East India Company 1740 to 1849 in the International Encyclopedia of War, edited by Gordon Martel in 2012. In 2015, he wrote the introduction to the English translation of Govind Pansare's famous Marathi book, Shivaji Kaun Hota? Who was Shivaji? Published by Left World Books. A double peer reviewed entry in the Oxford University Press online research encyclopedia of South Asian history called The Indian Army 1850 to 1950 was published in August 2019. Apart from all these academic accomplishments, he writes Hindi short stories, four of which have been published in newspapers and journals. His novel Dreamt Lives was published from Delhi in 2018 and has received excellent reviews on Amazon. Other publications include The Indian Fort as Site of Intersections, book chapter in Radhika Sessions, Narratives, Roots and Intersections in Pre-Modern Asia, published by Routledge London and New York in 2017. Past, Present and Oral History, which is a special article in the EPW, published in 2017. He has also written a paper locating Sayyid Ahmad Khan in colonial India in the Forward Press in April 2018. His novel Dreamt Lives and short stories, interview, etc., has been serialized on the multilingual online literary journal Mathribharti. His latest paper on the quotidian life of Marathi-speaking soldiers in 18th century has appeared in Hakara, September 2020. He has also written on the movies, films, and history. Today, he is here with us to speak on Marathi sources for medieval and early modern history, a synoptic view. Over to you, Anirudh.
Thank you very much for. Am I audible? I mean, there's always this problem with the mic.
You are audible.
Hello. You
You
are.
are.
You can hear. At any time, if you don't hear me, please interrupt and tell me, because see, in online talks and so on, these problems keep recurring because of the connectivity problems. Thank you very much, Nadeem, for saying all these kind words about me. And today I'm going to speak about. I'm going to speak about Marathi sources, and I shall also indicate the problems in trying to use these sources for writing a modern history of medieval and early modern Maharashtra. I mean, I'm not very particularly comfortable with the term early modern, but we've got so used to using it rather mindlessly over so many years, because in my view, uh, it's very difficult to see signs of what we call early modern in these sources. There's a certain cultural and social homogeneity in these sources, which we see from the 17th till the 18th century. Of course, there's an internal evolution, but whether any of them can be slotted into this category of early modern is a problematic unto itself. So, what I propose to do today in this brief presentation is to talk about Marathi primary sources on which the so-called Maratha historiography, which I feel is a kind of misnomer to begin with, is largely based. And although Maharashtrian historians and historians, especially based in Maharashtra, are well versed with these sources, historians outside Maharashtra usually don't know very much about these sources. They are not, especially in North India and Northwest India and East India, and even in southern India, where regional histories are quite strong, and the history of Mughal India and the Sultanate period is very, very strong. Usually, Marathi sources are not known that much. Most of these other histories are based on Arabic, Persian, and of course, European sources of the period. So, to begin with, whether the larger part of this historiographic corpus, which is known as Maratha history, does justice to these sources is a question which will not keep us away from our primary task here. I shall refer to the omnipresent problem of anachronism in historical analysis later, because I think historians must pay specific attention to the problem of anachronism in historical analysis. The collection of Marathi sources, mostly written in the Modi script, till this script was replaced by the Nagari, or if you prefer, Devanagari in the 19th century, because modern Marathi came to be written in a variant of the Devanagari script in the 19th century under the direction of Marathi intellectuals involved in the reconstruction of the Marathi language and, of course, the colonial state. For the construction of a modern history of medieval and early modern Maharashtra, these sources, collection of these sources began with the colonially inspired researches of James Grant Duff in early 19th century. And whenever we speak of using Marathi sources, or we speak of modern Maratha historiography, the first name which comes to our mind is that of James Grant Duff, who worked on Marathi sources in the early 19th century. He was the first modern colonial scholar to work on these sources in a very systematic manner. After the conquest of the so called Maratha territories, southern Maratha country and central and western Maratha country by the British following the Third Anglo Maratha War of 1818. So we have his monumental three-volume History of the Marathas, which was first published in 1826 and which was based on a treasure trove of Marathi and European sources of what became later on Maratha history. Now, we also know that Grant Duff carried a hoard of sources to Britain and wrote the book in Scotland. And many of those sources are available in the India Office Library and other archives and libraries of England to those scholars who are interested in Maratha history there. The, the PDF of this uh, enormous book is also available free, and those interested in journeying into the world of Marathi sources can study its copious references. In fact, the footnotes of this book, as well as the references which are cited towards the end of the book, give you a very can give you a fair idea of the large corpus of Marathi sources which Duff came across and collected, and then, of course, took away from India in the process of writing this book. In fact, Duff paid rich tributes to the Maharashtrian acumen for record keeping in the introduction to this book. He mentions, obviously with reference to select Bakhars, sources as large or even larger than the tome he was writing. Makes it very, he says, I was handed manuscripts which were much, much larger than the book which I was writing and which ultimately I wrote, because he wrote the introduction finally in Scotland. And he recounts the process by which he came across these sources. I'll talk about some of them later on. The meticulous method of uh, Grant Duff prepared the ground for the collection and classification of Marathi sources by a group of Maharashtrian scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Maratha history began to register a deeper impression on the popular imagination of the Maratha past. Although a number of Maharashtrians, including the pioneer Bhandarkar, created this project of history writing. You can actually call it, sometimes we call it the archival movement of Maratha history in the 19th century. This is an entire project which is very consciously fashioned after 1857. We talk of Bhandarkar to begin with because he was one of the first graduates of the Bombay University set up in 1857 and slightly senior to Rana Day. And Bhandarkar and Rana Day both played a very, very important role in the creation of, in the construction of the history of Maharashtra and the Deccan as we know it today. They were pioneers in this field. We must also remember the name of one of the greatest collector one of the greater collectors and record keepers of Maratha sources, a man who is called Itihasacharya V.K. Rajwade, who played a very, very important role in this entire process. He must be mentioned. His Those who are interested in looking at Marathi primary sources, voluminous Marathi primary sources, should look at his edited 22-volume Marathanच्या इतिहासाचे साधने, which basically means sources of Maratha history, which remains a very important primary source of Maratha history. And I mean, there are he also actually collected. Apart from this, he also worked on a number of other collections, which have become part and parcel of the primary sources usually used by historians working on Maratha history. So this entire Marathancha Itihasache Sadhane is a 5,500-page mini archive which deals with numerous aspects of social, cultural, political, and economic history of 17th century Maharashtra. And in a similar vein is the Shivkalin Patra Sar Sangrah, edited by Apte and Kelkar, which is basically a collection of primary sources. Patra Sar means all the letters of that time of Shivkalin. Shivkalin means the times of Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji Raje. And these letters and these correspondence is collected in this Shivkalin Patra Sar Sangrah, edited by Apte and Kelkar. This is also available as a PDF, which any scholar who'd like to read them and who'd like to actually write a research paper on an aspect of Maratha history, or who'd like to do a short MPhil dissertation on any chosen aspect, can easily access. Others to whom we are indebted for searching and storing Marathi language sources would include persevering men like Khare, Parasnis, Bhave, Divekar, Sardesai, and of course, uh, Sir Jadunath Sarkar. Both Jadunath Sarkar and Sardesai roamed around Maharashtra collecting sources, and they were part of this entire movement which led to the construction of the National Archives of India. And of course, all the archives in Maharashtra are greatly indebted to the footwork, literal footwork done by Sardesai and Jadunath Sarkar, who used to roam around incognito in Maharashtra, searching for records and with great difficulty acquiring them from their holders and then cataloging and storing them. Indeed, Elphinstone himself was a pioneer in this process. He was, of course, the governor of Bombay after he was the first governor of Bombay after the vanquishing of the Marathas in the third Anglo-Maratha War of 1718. And Elphinstone started the process of creating this entire institution, this entire collection, which we now know as the Peshwa Daftar. So this was the background, this background of 19th century. We must know this background. We must know the important histories which were written in the 19th century, beginning with Grant Duff's work and going up to the work of people like Ranade, who wrote his The Rise of British Power, which was published posthumously in 1900. So in between these two, I'll refer to them, and in between these two, there's a period of, let's say, roughly 100 years in which a lot of collection is being done. And of course, then Rajwade is working in the early part of the 20th century, and by 1920, 22, 23, Rajwade collected, and he spent all his life. Rajwade's wife died early after his marriage. He did not remarry, and he decided to dedicate his life to the cause of Maratha historiography, and he became a pioneer in the. He became the Itihasacharya as we know him today. So Let me briefly look at the description and content of these Marathi sources. Of course, in a short presentation of, let's say, 45 minutes to an hour, it's impossible to look at a very large. It's impossible to look at the whole of the entire corpus of collected Marathi sources because they are too large. In fact, two or three, two or three MA level or BA level courses should be designed to actually make the students go through such sources if a university decides to do so. But here I'm going to, it's going, since my lecture talks about a synoptic view, let me give you a brief description and content of these sources. Second point in this lecture, Marathi material on the economic, social, cultural, and political history and historical geography of the Konkan, Ghat, and Desh regions of present-day Maharashtra is usually classified as follows. Remember, Maharashtra normally, even medieval Maharashtra, was usually seen as comprising uh, three parts: Konkan, which is the narrow coastal strip between the Western Ghats and the Arabian Sea, and then, of course, then you have the Western Ghats, and to the east of the Western Ghat is the Desh region, which is now called, which is called, Maharashtra proper. So you have Konkan, Ghat, and Desh regions of present-day Maharashtra. These sources are usually classified as follows. First, you have the inscriptional records like the ones presented in Dikshit's Marathi Shahitil Shilalekh or Tulpule's Prachin Marathi Koriv Lake. So these Shilaleks and Koriv lakes are found in large parts of Maharashtra, and they are written in Marathi, early Marathi. These are pre-modern Marathi lakes, and they can deal with things like land grants made to temples, or revenue granted to individuals, and so on and so forth. They are all very much like inscriptional records which you find from most parts of India, with respect to ancient and early medieval India. And paper was not very common in early medieval India, so you really had a lot of inscriptions coming on stones and so on and so forth. So you have these two important collections, these two extremely important collections, which have those who are interested in the Shila Lake, the stone inscriptions, Koriv Lake and Shila Lake, should go through these two volumes, which can easily be accessed nowadays, because a lot of material has been put on put online by the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, as well as the Itihas Sanshadhan Itihas Bharat Itihas Sanshadhan Mandal, and so on. All the organizations have a lot of material which is available online. The second main cache of records are the archival records in Marathi, and these would include the Peshwa Daftar in Pune, comprising 34,972 rumals. So when you go to the Peshwa Daftar, you are directed to the rumals. The rumals basically mean bundles of records, of which 27,332 are in Marathi, and the rest are in English, Gujarati, and Persian. The main Peshwa Daftar comprises the daftars such as the Shahu Daftar, Peshwa Daftar proper, Angriya Daftar, Satara Maharajas Daftar, Jamao Daftar, Karnataka Daftar, Sholapur Daftar, and papers dealing with zakat, basically customs, which are extremely important for writing the economic history of medieval and quote unquote early modern Maharashtra, 18th century Maharashtra. The Marathi Daftar Rumals contain information on a variety of subjects like daily accounts, ledgers of grants, watans, inams, charities, the Admiralty, such as the Department of Admiralty, headed by the Dhulap family, Anandarao Dhulap and his family, after the defeat of Tulaji Angre in 1756. In fact, the the naval province, the naval province with its headquarters at Bassein was handed over to the Dhulab family, who became heads of the admiralty, and most of their records, most of the letters and correspondence which they had with the Peshwa in Pune is part of the admiralty records. This was also used. These admiralty records have been used by V.K. Apte in his history of the Maratha Navy and warfare and so on, which is a very important source of the naval history of Maharashtra, which we all read when we talk about Kanoji, Angre, naval technology, and so on and so forth. The daftars also have papers and letters of generals and ministers, village accounts prepared usually by the Kulkarnis, forts, reports sent by Kiledars and accountants, household matters, sanads, cash accounts, and of course, correspondence of a general nature. Now, let us remember that the Huzur Daftar, which was basically the Daftar of the Peshwa's Secretariat, which is also called Huzuriyat, which was the Peshwa's Secretariat, employed more than 200 accountant clerks and had subdivisions like the Chalte Daftar, Ek Berji Daftar, and Potnis Daftar. The uh, Peshwas were true administrators and record keepers. They had begun their career when they began their career as the prime ministers of Shahu. When Balaji Vishwanath started that, he was basically an organizer of finance. The Peshwas and the families associated with the Peshwas, their brothers and their cousins and so on, they were they used to interact regularly with sahukars and organize. They were busy organizing military finance all the time. So accounting was extremely important to them, apart from military and civil administration. So they became very good record keepers. We should thank them, thank the entire administration, Peshwa administration, for actually having created a very organized system of record keeping, which of course was taken over by Elphinstone, whose efforts were then important for the creation of the Peshwa Daftar, to which historians and scholars keep going and in search of Maratha history of that time. Further, these subdivisions were divided into rose kurds. The rose kurds are like the rose namchas of police stations, which are basically day books. So you may have years in which you have day-to-day accounts, day-to-day information about things like servants or things like expenditures, various kinds of expenditures. Maintained under the following heads: the categories of records which were maintained, expenditure and other records were maintained under the following heads. You had ghadnis, which are basically ledgers. You have jabsalis, which are basically correspondence. You have the district revenue records, which are called the prantajmas, and the pug, which are basically accounts of expenditure on cavalry, horses, equipment, servant pays, and so on and so forth. And chitnisi, as the word suggests, political and diplomatic correspondence. The surnames Chitnis, Subnis, and Fadnis are related to officers in charge of writing letters and maintaining records. Now, as if this is not enough, in addition to all this, we have a very important cache of records, which is known as the Nashik Tirthopadhyay records. The Nashik Tirthopadhyay records are basically family information sheets of pilgrims who visited Nashik from various parts of India, including Punjab and Gujarat and North India and so on, running into thousands of pages with details of places from where these pilgrims came, the names of the pilgrims, the various castes of these pilgrims, the gotras, etc., of the visitors, and so on. So, for a history of pilgrimage in medieval and 18th century Maharashtra, these records are extremely important. You'll come to know how much Indians used to travel in those days, like Maharashtrians used to travel regularly to Kashi, to Mathura, and to Kedarnath, and to various other important sites of sites of pilgrimages and so on in the north, and Thanesar, and Kurukshetra, and so on and so forth. So you really have, these are records which are extremely important, and they tell you about, I mean, they are a very important, a very important, I will say, very important career of social, cultural, and even place name histories of that time. Then you have Satara Rajas and Peshwas diaries, which are edited and published, which have information on practically everything under the sun, ranging from forts to marriage cess and bheels. You have regional records and daftars of various prominent gharanas, like the Purandare Daftar, for instance, which is a very large collection, and which is also available in a PDF, in a PDF form. In fact, I have some of these PDFs on my computer. I have the entire, you know, in Sadhane and Purandare Daftar, which were all collected by people like Rajwade in the early part of the 20th century, which you have on your on computer, and you can keep referring to them when you write your papers, or you think about Maratha history in general, and so on. We must also remember the pioneering work of organizations and institutions like the Bharat Itihas Sanshodhak Mandal and the various journals dedicated to the reproduction of Marathi sources, Patre, Yade, and Sadhane in general. And all this is too well known to be repeated here, so I'm not going to bore you with these details. Several journals were produced in the 19th century, and several journals were produced in the 20th century. Some worked for 10 years, some worked for 20 years. But while they were produced, while they were published, they performed a stellar role in the reproduction and reprinting of primary source material from various parts of Maharashtra. Another important source in Marathi is what is called the Kul Vritant, which are basically family histories. All families in Maharashtra, prominent families in Maharashtra, usually have a Kul Devat, a Kul Devata, and a, a, a village from where they belong. And this Kul Devat and the records of that Kul would be kept in these village temples, or other repositories of records in these villages. And these would then become Kul Vritant, written in Marathi, of almost all the prominent families which originated in the Desh or Konkan, like the Shindes, the Dafles, the Pratinidhis, the Angres, the Salunkhes, the Shitoles, the Pawars, the Bhosles, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many prominent families. These are Maratha Sardar families, families of administrators, families of important Brahmin administrators, military leaders, and almost all these families, Kul Vritant, have been published, and they are available to the public, either in a printed form, or sometimes possibly also as PDFs if you have to search for them. I don't know. I haven't got them as a PDF, but apparently most of them are published, and one can go and sit in these libraries and have a look at these sources. The third category of sources is the historical and literary sources nowadays, which are also collectively known as the history in the vernacular. And these are the sources, especially the Bakhars among them, which are usually referred to by those who are not who are beginning to gain a familiarity with Marathi sources. In fact, there are three kinds of three important historical and literary sources produced by the scribes, intellectuals, writers, and anonymous people also of Maharashtra, from the 16th century onwards till the 18th century, and also early 19th century. And these are the the Bakhars, B, the Pawadas, and C, the Lavanes. The historian's opinion of the Bakhars has changed over time, but in the 19th century, when positivist modern history writing was in fashion, many historians, including Rajwade to begin with, did not take the Bakhars very seriously. In fact, Jadunath Sarkar calls them a collection of gossips and fables and so on and so forth. And but of course, of late, as as the history of Marathas has started taking regional history and mates and representation of uh, the self-representation of Maharashtrians more and more seriously in writing the accounts of medieval Maharashtra. The opinion of Bakhars has changed over time, and in vernacular nowadays, when people speak of vernacular history, which is rich in regional narratives, the Bakhars have started acquiring a particular space in them. So let me briefly talk about the Bakhars, the Pawadas, and Lavanes, and then move on to the problem of interpreting Marathi sources, after which we can have a discussion on this brief presentation. Let's take the Bakhars first. The Bakhars, Bakhar is a metathesis of the term, mm, khabar, which in Arabic means news, from which the word akhbar comes. So, Bakhar is basically news, it's basically a report. The Bakhars, when commissioned, usually appear as hagiographies rich in a variety of detail. When written over a length of time by multiple authors, like the oldest of them, the Mahikavati Bakhar, they become important texts of historical geography and, of course, social, economic, and cultural history. Written between the 15th and the 18th centuries, more than 200 Bakhars seem to have survived. Uh, Almost 100 of them have been published. The Kaifiyat and the Bakhar belong to the same genre of uh, literary historical writing, and they often overlap, like the Bhau Sahibanchi Kaifiyat and Bhau Sahibanchi Bakhar. So, real or ascribed authors of many Bakhars have been identified by the Maharashtrian historians and famous editors like R.V. Hedwadkar. Hedwadkar he played a very important role in the collection and the editing of these Bakhars. Most of these Bakhars have been published in Pune by the Venus Prakashans, and they are very decently priced. So almost anybody can buy them and read them. Some of the Bakhars are also available in English translation, but anybody who knows the Marathi language and the Devanagari script can read the Bakhars and come to his own conclusions about history writing and history on the basis of what he finds in them. But they are extremely rich and they are detailed. They are detailed, literary texts, historical literary texts. Second, we have the Pawadas. The Pawadas are basically ballads celebrating important individuals and events which have become iconic in Maratha history. For example, the Pawada about the slaying of Afzal Khan by Chhatrapati Shivaji, by Shivaji, who was not the Chhatrapati at that time, by was actually it is said was commissioned by Jijabai herself, Shivaji's mother. Mm, or the capture of Sinhagad. So you have this Bakhar of Sinhagad captured by Tanaji. But the Bakhars may also the Pawadas may also describe the condition of the people. For instance, let's take the example of Parshuram's Deshastiticha Pawada, which is about common life in Maharashtra. He talks about the people, he talks about their conditions, their problems, troubles, and so on. Pawadas were written in the 19th century and could be overtly political. Pawadas, which were written in the 19th century, could be overtly political, like the Pawada of Kulwadi Bhushan Shivaji Raje, written and popularized by Jyotibai Phule. Jyotibai Phule, who 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 actually who who pioneered the idea of promoting of actually projecting and interpreting Shivaji as a Janta Raja, as a Raja of the people, who was basically who established his rule, mm, uh, to militate against Brahminical hegemony. Pawadas have remained popular in Maharashtra, and they are integral to the people's imagination of the past. And it can be said that the writers of the Pawadas in the Deccan played the same role which the Charans and Bhats played in North India. Thirdly, we have the Lavanes. The Lavanes probably originated in the military life of the Marathas, and unlike the Pawadas, which are chivalrous verses, Lavanis accompanied the tamasha and dancing girls who entertained the soldiers. So it's basically Lavanis seem to have emanated from the army camp, from the Lashkar. And it is believed that the genre of Lavani was produced by poets known as the Marathi Shahirs. Ob- Obviously, this is a reference to the Urdu Persian word shair. The Pawadas and the words composed by Marathi Shahirs were crucial to the evolution of Maratha social identity in the 18th century. So, uh, the Bakhars, the Patre, the letters, like the letters written by commanders like Antaji Mankeshwar or Sadashiv Rao Bhau to the Peshwa, the Daftars, the Pawadas, the Lavanis, the Vanshavalis, inscriptions, the Charitras, which are basically, they can be, Charitras can be uh, biographies, or they can be autobiographies, like the Atma Charitra of Nana Fadnavis, given to Grant Duff by his wife, whom Duff met, or another category of records called the Thailis, such as the one ascribed to Malhar Raoji Holkar called the Holkaranchi Thaili, which is sometimes taken as an important additional source for the Panipat campaign and the third battle of Panipat. Basically, Holkar's explanation of uh, his explanation of the causes and consequences of the Panipat campaign led by Sadashiv Rao Bhau, who just wouldn't listen to the advice tendered to him by Malhar Raoji Holkar, who was an experienced Maratha commander in North India. So Thaili is like it's almost like a remonstrance made by Holkar in front to the Peshwa. He's actually explaining his conduct and so on. They must be read, all these records, Pavadas, Lavnis, Vanshavalis, Daftars, and so on and so forth, must be read very, very carefully by the modern historian. They cannot be taken like any other source, they cannot be taken at face value. But what is the reason for this, apart from the advice given on the subject by the masters of interpretations like Mark Bloch or microhistorians like Carlo Ginzburg, who follows Bloch's method closely? The reasons are very, very clear. The reason why we must look at these sources very, very, very carefully and very critically. The first reason is the fact that the Marathi language was transformed into its modern form during the 19th century. And we must remember that it was in this language, influenced by the ideas of nationalism borrowed from the West, that the historical discourse of Maharashtra was fashioned after the presidency universities were established in 1857. Much of this discourse, as Stewart Gordon reminded us years ago, is an ideological response to the gigantic work done by Grant Duff in the early part in the first decade, first quarter of the 19th century. It is also a gloss on Duff's work, as Gordon says, because under the gloss You have the categories with which Duff was working when he was writing a history of the Marathas in 3 volumes. It's a huge. I think all students and all teachers who are interested in reading Maratha history must go through Grant Duff's History of the Marathas. It's a book which people refer to but don't read usually. It's a book which has been condemned as as a product of colonial historiography, but nonetheless, I feel Grant Duff's book must be read by everybody who's interested in Maratha history, and Grant Duff's reference to the sources must be very, very carefully seen. In fact, what I would say is that between Grant Duff's History of the Marathas, which was published first in 1826, forgotten and then later published after 1857, after Grant Duff's death in 1869, it was published again, and then, of course, suddenly in the period of the rise of the archival movement in Maharashtra from the 1870s, 80s onwards, Duff book became very popular and was printed and reprinted and became part of the standard text, which was taught to students of Indian history in most of the universities. So, between Grant Duff's History of the Marathas, 1826, and M.G. Ranade's Story of the Rise of Maratha Power, which was published in 1900, the fundamentals of Maratha historiography were laid down. The influence of Maratha nationalism on the Marathi language is statistically evident in the fact that between 1800 and 1950, now this is very important, 14% of all Marathi books published were on history, and 46% comprised literature books like novels, of which a large number were historical. Even books on religion referred to history. In fact, of all non fiction books, almost 25% were historical works. So, from this, you can easily infer that history sells in modern Maharashtra, and most of it is Hindu nationalist. And I mean, those who are interested in looking at a paper on the survey of Marathi sources can refer to V.D. Divekar's paper in the IESHR in 1978, in which he has given details of the kind of sources available and what we can glean from those sources. He also points out that the sources have to be read very carefully because the Marathi language underwent major transformations in the 19th century. The other point, this is point B about the care with which we must approach these sources, is about the vocabulary of the pre-colonial Marathi sources, which, despite the editing efforts of the nationalists, is different from the conceptual format in which they were integrated into modern historiography by the largely upper caste Maharashtrian historians in the 19th and 20th century. The this critical this the cris- Thus the critical historian should be aware of this difference. Otherwise, he risks falling into the trap of linguistic anachronism and thereby misinterpreting these varied and rich sources. There's a danger of losing oneself in these sources. The sources are so rich, the sources are so varied, and they are such a great distraction, because if you start once you start reading them, then the tendency of the tendency to keep reading letters and keep reading various details grips you, and the danger of your losing your perspective, and the essential task of selecting sources to write the kind of history you want to write, that danger starts becoming very, very palpable. So the risk of misinterpretation of these sources can only be eliminated by the historian who is aware, as E.H. Carr wrote, who is aware of the fact that his view of history reflects his view of society. A nationalist who is tempted to translate pre modern patriotism as modern nationalism must resist that temptation, because these sources don't very easily yield to this kind of temptation. Similarly, his critic must resist the urge to paint a quote unquote secular picture of the past. Because after all, let us not forget that the past is a foreign country in which neither our currency nor our languages may work. So, in sum, uh, there is a very large corpus of Marathi language sources, which a modern historian, contemporary historian of medieval, early modern, and modern Maharashtra can approach. These sources, uh, these sources have various. These sources are available in various genres, in which you can have historical literary sources, prose, poetry, Pawadas, Lavanes, inscriptions. You have buckers which go back to the 16th century. You have letters, you have correspondence, and so on and so forth. From the older Shilhara dynasty, Kannada dynasty period, and enormous amount of information is available to the modern historian who wants to work on quote unquote Maratha history, or history of the region which came to be called Maharashtra later on in our political discourse. So, but he has to be careful, uh, uh, because he is living in the present. His perspective is guided by a language which doesn't belong to those sources. The sources belong to a different time. They were produced in a different time. They are written in a different language. Their lexicon is different. Their vocabulary is different. Sometimes even the script in which they were written is Modi. It is not the Devanagari script. So you either need to become familiar with the Modi script, because several sources are still available in the Modi script. All of them have not been all of them have not been converted into Devanagari. Of course, a large corpus is available in Devanagari. Important sources are available in Devanagari, but you can get people in Pune who can help you with Modi, or you can learn it. I'm told that within a few months you can actually learn the Modi script, and most research students in Pune and Bombay are taught the script. So keep these things in mind when, as students, you approach Maratha history, and you approach Marathi language sources. And never forget the fact that the past is a foreign country. The past is not your country, in which people will understand the language which you speak and the ideas in which you express your identities and your political preferences. Thank you very much.
Uh, Thank you, Professor Anirudh Deshpande. You added much to our knowledge. Naturally, this is one of the aspects on which not many people have actually read. In spite of that, there are a number of queries which have been put. The first question which I would like to put up before you is by Mr. Ali Heather. Sir, I once read that when Shahu returned to Maharashtra, he commissioned a mosque in memory of Zinatun Nisa Begum called Begum Masjid of Satara. If this is true, then can you provide information about this? Is it still intact?
No, unfortunately, I mean, uh, all of a sudden, I cannot provide information on that. But I mean, if it is a historical fact, then it can be investigated, and we can look up the source. And maybe, I mean, maybe as a historian of 18th or 19th century, one can actually see whether this is true, and if it is true, what source mentions it, and one can respond to Ali Haider later on this.
Right.
But off the cuff, it is very difficult to say whether because all the sources are not here in my mind, so I really cannot immediately go through the sources and tell you. One can research that and have a look at it, but it's quite possible, because
Next question.
Shahu was well treated by the Mughals. He was not badly treated by the Mughals, so this possibility cannot be ruled out. In fact,
Uh,
he used to be called Shah by Aurangzeb. That is why his name is Shahu.
thank you, Professor Deshpande. Next question is by Dr. Lakshmi Kant Mishra. Whether Marathi has any vernacular tradition of history writing at any period of time in medieval and modern times.
I think the question has been answered in the presentation. That
Uh,
Marathi has a very rich tradition of vernacular history writing.
mm,
When you talk
mm.
of Bakars, or you talk of Kulvritant, or you talk of Pawadas, Lavanes, or you talk about the various itihasas which were written by various scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries, you have you have a very rich tradition of history. The Bakars themselves, there are 200, apparently 200 Bakars. So Bakars alone would comprise a very rich tradition of vernacular history writing.
Can you say something about the Marathi literature during this period? And are there any collections like that of Mackenzie's collections?
You can, uh, you see, collections began to happen mostly in the 19th century. So if you look up the work of all these people I have mentioned, people like Rajwade or Parasnis and so on, the Marathi chroniclers of the 19th century, they have produced a large number of collections of Marathi sources. So I have referred to Divekar's paper in the IASHR of 1978, and Madam Mishra can have a look at that paper. It's you can actually you can read that paper, and that's a very rich paper, and you can actually follow the lines indicated in that paper. You can also look up Prachi Deshpande's work, Creative Pasts, which deals with identity formation in Maharashtra and the role of vernacular literature, and especially Marathi Shahirs in the creation of Maratha identity as a Kshatriya identity in the 18th century. So once you look up these important books, even Stewart Gordon's book has a very large corpus of material to which he referred in his excellent monograph, The Marathas, which I'm sure Nadeem has gone through, because this is a very, very important book. In fact, in Delhi, whenever somebody speaks of Maratha history, people bring up Stewart Gordon's work. They say, "Bhai, aapne Gordon padha hai, nahi padha." So if you look up these books, I'm sure you'll get very large bibliographies, and then you can follow them.
The next question. The next question is by Mirza Hasnan. Sir, how do you see Mughal Maratha relations? According to treaties done by which Sahu was released, and also a treaty which was done between Sayyid brothers and Balaji Vishwanath in 1718, and by Maharji Shinde being given the title of Wakilul Mutlaq, their relations look more like of allies instead of enemies. So, why their rivalry is given a communal color?
That is because some historians like the communal color. That is why they have given history a communal color. You see, E.H. Carr said very clearly many years ago in his What is History. He says very clearly that a historian's view of society is reflected in his view of history. So if your view of society is that of a communal bigot, or your view of society is that of a sectarian, you will try to give history a sectarian. You will not use, but you will misuse history. That is the difference between reading and analyzing history and misusing history for political purposes. Everybody knows that everybody knows that history of people, history of civilizations, history of empires, kingdoms is always a history of conflict and friendship, conflict and cooperation also. So there is no history in the world where you have only conflict and no cooperation, or only cooperation and no conflict. All societies are like that. Classes can cooperate, classes are in conflict, castes cooperate, castes are in conflict. Similarly, political forces are in conflict. This is not the time of this is not the time of the First World War or the Second World War, in which you are trying to finish off the opponent once and for all, or you are planning genocides like like the ones planned by Adolf Hitler. against the Jews, or the genocide of Armenians planned and executed by the Turks, which became the blueprint for the genocide of Jews planned and executed by the Germans. These are that is not the time in which people are thinking in modern terms. Communalism is a post-colonial, colonial, modern ideology, and certainly, if you start looking at the medieval period from the perspective of this ideology, you will end up communalizing conflicts. I mean, just a few days ago, I was looking at R.C. Majumdar's book, An Advanced History of India. R.C. Majumdar, Kalinkar Dutt, and Rai Chaudhury's book, and I came across a lovely paragraph on Tipu Sultan in that book. I would like to actually, if I had the book right now in front of me, I have actually noted that paragraph down. Someday I will write that paragraph and actually present it in a Facebook post or something for people to share. And R.C. Majumdar, who is known not as a leftist historian, but who was often known as a right of center, kind of historian, who was not exactly communal like some other historians on both sides of the fence are, but who was certainly not a leftist, who was certainly a right of center, inclined towards, let's say, looking at history as a history of event and individuals. He writes about Tipu Sultan, and he's full of praise for Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali, and their initiatives in matters of religion, in matters of society, in matters of technology, and in matters of being far sighted in creating their regime and kingdom and so on. So you know uh, rivalry is always given the color which the historian has in his mind. So if the historian's mind is communal, he will try to give a rivalry a communal color, irrespective of the facts of history. It is very well known that the Marathas became the regents of the Mughal Empire from the times of Mahadaji Shinde, and they continued to control Delhi, Agra, Mathura, and Aligarh, where Nadim is sitting at the moment. All these places were under the control of the Marathas, especially because they had the Farmans with the British conquest of these regions in 1818. And we all know that Marathas used to have they had a what I would say, they had a mm, love and hate relationship with the Afghans and the North Indian Muslims and the Mughals. So it all depended upon how politics shaped up at a particular point in the 18th century. So one would be writing letters to the same people, and one would be fighting with the people the next day, and one would be fighting with somebody one day, and one would be seeking his favors and help another day, and that person would actually do that favor and help you, forgetting what you would have done to him, 6 months ago or whatever. That was the relationship which the Marathas had with the Jats also, because they were at loggerheads with Surajmal Jat, but then it was Surajmal who helped them after their decimation at the in the fields of Panipat in 1761. So these things used to happen, and there was violence, but there was also peace, like most periods in history.
Quite
These are
correct,
not.
sir.
These are not. These are not. These are not. We don't have wars of religion like we had in Europe, for instance, from 1500 to from 1520s to let us say from to 1648 till the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, and even afterwards, the wars of religion continued. But we never had that kind of history in India. It's difficult to factually substantiate the clash of civilizations thesis with respect to Indian history.
Right, quite correct. Let's have the next question, please. And the next question is by Dr. Kamlesh Mohan. How can vernacular sources help the historian to capture the responses of creative writers to epidemics? What happened to that question? Epidemics and reaction of Chapekar brothers to Rand's plague measures and female honor.
I think I will refer you to Shraddha Kumbhojkar's article on this, which is very well written. I am not an expert on these matters, and Rand was imposed by the British on Pune, and of course, the upper castes resented his presence there because they began to use force to enter people's houses and check them and so on for the plague of the late 1890s, and that led to conflict. And then there was a reaction against Rand, and Rand was he was basically assassinated by the Chapekar brothers, whose statues have been erected there. And uh, this has been researched upon by other scholars. I'm not an expert in this matter, but I think there is a very good piece by, you can check out Shraddha Kambojkar's piece on this. She's written on this, and there are other pieces also. If you just carry out a little internet search, you will find many pieces on this episode of Rand's assassination. But this question really has no bearing on the topic of the lecture or the Marathi sources as such.
Can we have the question of Parsa Venkateshwar Rao Jr.? Uh, by the time these literary sources came to be written, what was the state of Marathi language compared to the period of Sant Gyaneshwar?
That's a very big question to answer at this stage. The uh, Sant Samudaya, the entire uh, Sant Pratha of Maharashtra, where you have people like Chakradhar, who's the founder of the Mahanubhav sect, and you have people like Namdev, you have people like Naneshwar, Tukaram, from the 14th century onwards till the 17th century. You have all this entire bhakti movement. When you have this uh, Sant Vagmayas, the behavior of the sants, the way they spoke, they started speaking the Marathi language. Obviously, the languages undergo changes every 50, 60 years, 100 years, and so on and so forth. And the literary sources themselves, for instance, the Mahikawati Bakhar, which is basically a Bakhar based in Mahim, which was this North Konkan region, which came under the Shalhari dynasty, whose origins are in the Telugu, Kannada regions, and so on. For all these things, the language keeps changing. The words from various languages keep coming in, keep creeping into Marathi. By the 18th century, especially when you see the Bakhars, most of the Bakhars written in the 18th century have a great many Persian words. So there's a great influence on the Persian language also, because the Maharashtrians are consciously writing to to the to North Indians, to the Mughals, and to the other powers. There are diplomatic relations growing between them and the Marathas, as a consequence of which Persian words, Arabic words, other words also start playing a very, very important role, and the vocabulary becomes very, very enriched. And then again it's changed. It becomes more Sanskritized with the establishment of the Devanagari movement and nationalism in the 19th century. So Marathi language, it was a dynamic language, and it continued to change. And of course, I'm not a linguist, and I'm not a language expert. I'm a historian. But again, you have people have worked on these things, and I would refer. I mean, if you refer to Divekar's article, you find that there are other references in that article to those people who have worked on these on the contribution of various people who transformed and enriched the Marathi language from the times of Sant Jnaneshwar till the 19th century. So, of course, it's a very dynamic thing, and mm, it would take a, a lifetime's work for a linguist to actually go through each source and check the transformation of languages. In fact, the sources have undergone so much editing over the 19th and 20th century that it will become a very, very difficult task to actually point out by reference to grammar or vocabulary or lexicon the transformation which the language has undergone over 300-400 years. All languages change like that.
Uh, so before I take up Hasnain Aziz's question, there is a comment by Nalini Thakur. Thank you for a fascinating lecture on Maratha sources. Very informative.
Well, thank you very much
So
for the comment.
now let us take Hastain Aziz. Hastain Aziz Saab says, "Sir, do we find any reference in Maratha sources writing positively about Aurangzeb's good treatment of Shahu? Because Aurangzeb was the one who named and married him in 1703. And Shahu is also said to visit Aurangzeb's tomb to pay him respect. And do we find any Maratha sources written in Persian?"
There are Persian records, Persian rumals in the Peshwa Daftar, about 29 rumals written in Persian, which I think, which you people would be in a better position to go and read and make something of it. Maharashtrians used to write letters in chaste Persian to the Mughal emperor Shivaji himself. Shivaji had a Muslim scribe who used to write letters in chaste Persian to Aurangzeb. There are two or three letters which have been reproduced by Govind Pansare in his book Shivaji Kaun Hota Hu Wo Shivaji, in which Shivaji actually criticizes Aurangzeb a lot for imposing burdens and jizya and so on and so forth on both, by the way, on both Hindus and Muslims. And he compares Shivaji unfavorably. He compares Aurangzeb unfavorably with Aurangzeb's ancestors. He said, "You are a basically in to paraphrase Shivaji's letter. He says you are basically what I mean. In short, he's saying you are a disgrace to the memory of Akbar and the great Jagat Guru Akbar and Shah Jahan and Jahang." He says all these badshahs, they ruled in accordance with the traditions of Hindustan, Hindi, Bharat, and so all those things. And but you have departed from that. You are a tyrant and you are intolerant, and your burdens are crushing the Hindus and Muslims both. He says very clearly, and there is no communal. There's not a little communal tinge in those letters at all. I mean, so mm, um, and even it is very difficult to find Marathi sources which praise Aurangzeb. Uh, Fair enough, because Aurangzeb really did not do very praiseworthy things in Maharashtra during his campaign. So those are also the facts. Um, but the fact which have been mentioned are recorded in Marathi sources. But really, I would be hard put to find a source which praises uh, Aurangzeb. In fact, many of the sources from the Peshwa period onwards don't refer to Aurangzeb. References to Aurangzeb are not there in many of the sources. Bhau Sahib and Chibakhar does not refer to Aurangzeb, and Kaifiyat does not refer to Aurangzeb. The letters of Antaji Mankeshwar or in fact, they seem to have. It seems after Aurangzeb's death, uh, very rapidly new equations began to evolve between the Marathas and the Mughals. As Maratha power expanded northwards, the Mughals realized the power of the Marathas and they began to come to compromise with them. The Sayyid brothers, and then later on, people like and Shah Alam and so on and so forth. So the relationship changed, and in that changed relationship, you don't really find much references to Shivaji or to Aurangzeb. Although Jyotiba Phule's Shivaji Raja यांचा Pawada, if you find Shivaji's Pawada, in that he actually abuses Aurangzeb as a Sacha Harami Musalman. So he calls him that, and basically he was not a good Muslim, according to even Jyotirao Phule. So that's the way it is. And I think we need to go beyond these questions now. Actually, these questions really don't make any. These questions are not important to us anymore, because what's the point
In
of
fact,
discussing these things?
Anirudh, as you rightly pointed out, majorly he is ignored by the
Yeah, I mean, in the 18th
government.
century, they don't talk about him.
Who talks about him? Hardly anybody. In
See,
fact,
Aurangzeb.
the Persians also, the Safavids who are contemporary to Aurangzeb,
Hmm.
there are very critical references to Aurangzeb.
Yes.
So I mean, as you rightly pointed out, there were very few good things which he had done. So
He
what?
was bad to, you see, he was bad to the Shias also. He was not only the,
No, no,
non-Muslims
he
otherwise.
was bad to humanity in general. I don't think that he was bad to Shias or Hindus. Why he probably never considered all that. But
Hmm.
the
But
fact
on the
is that
other, but also let us also remember that during his time, uh, uh, you know, Kafi Khan is very critical of Aurangzeb. He wrote this,
yes,
this
yeah,
entire.
yeah,
Kafi Khan is extremely critical of Aurangzeb and his campaign in the Deccan, and he's full of praise for the Marathas. So
mm, mm,
something which Aurangzeb would have hated him to write, because he wrote it secretly, and then it was
mm,
published later on and so on. But we must remember that, but he was Shivaji Aurangzeb also treated those Marathas who went over to him with a great amount of generosity, giving them jagirs and giving them positions and so on and so forth and all that. So there is that side of Aurangzeb also. Let's keep that in
yes,
mind.
yes,
And of course,
exactly.
we have to take into consideration Athar Ali's work on Mughal nobility under Aurangzeb, in which the number of Hindu nobles is much larger than, as a proportion of more nobles, than it was in Akbar's time. And so on. But I think we
Well,
should go beyond these questions of individuals and so on.
exactly, exactly. Uh, mm, there is a comment by Parsa Venkateshwara Rao, which I would like to highlight. Venkateshwar Rao Jr. Points out,
Hmm.
good warning, don't read secularism into the past. Mm.
I would say don't read anything into the past. Read the past.
That is why I picked
See,
up that it
see,
is not only
see,
a question of secularism.
you see, the
Uh,
question is the question is the point is not to say that one does not have political preferences.
mm,
One must be honest with oneself and say, this is my political preference. Okay.
mm,
But just because I have this political preference does not mean that the historical sources or those who were writing those sources also have the same political preferences as I. We must learn to not only disagree amongst each other, we must also learn, as historians, we have to learn to live with these disagreements between the sources and what we would like to say. And only by confronting our own prejudices and biases can we be more objective in our analysis of historical sources. Something which Carlo Ginzburg is very clear. He says in a couple of essays, he has made it very clear. He is a great advocate of microhistory. Microhistory basically means it's like looking at history from a microscope, subjecting all sources to a very careful microscopic investigation, and locating an event or a statement or a literary text or an interrogation or anything in its proper context only after looking at the whole thing through a microscope. And he says often you should read the source without reading the historiography of the source. Because what happens when you have a mandatory chapter on historiography in most PhD theses, most books will have a chapter on historiography in which you will say, okay, Deshpande has said this about that, and Nadeem has said this about this, or Irfan Habib Saab has said this about this. Now your mind will become more and more colored by what these other historians have been saying about this. He says, for a few days, forget the historiography bit and just read the source carefully, slowly. Give it a close, slow reading, and then follow the connections which you can make through the sources. Then you may be able to write a less subjective history of the past. Nothing is purely objective, but I mean, one has to be careful. One cannot the past is neither communal nor secular. I mean, you cannot use the category of secularism to describe the past in the same way as you cannot use nationalism or communalism to describe the past.
well, there is another comment by Professor Lakshmi Kant Mishra, which I would like to highlight. Uh, one can't just marginalize literature and leave it to linguistics to work upon. literature need to be investigated upon seriously by the historians.
Of course, and
So,
I don't
yeah.
disagree. I don't
Mm.
disagree entirely. I agree with that entirely. I agree
And
with.
Lakshmikant ji
I
very
mean, not
soon.
why literature? Almost everything which the historian lays his hands on must be investigated seriously, including the artifact, including the fields, including the archaeological sites. Everything has to be very carefully seen. But on the
Uh,
other hand, we must also understand that without its ancillary disciplines, history will collapse. So, if you are doing archaeology, it is not necessary for you to become a forensic archaeologist for that. You cannot do carbon dating. It has to be done by a chemical laboratory. Forensic archaeology is a super specialization branch. Now, because of forensic archaeology, a lot of new things are coming out from Egypt and various places where archaeology is being practiced in a very scientific fashion. You cannot be an expert photographer. So you have to, like a architect depends upon a good mason, a good plumber, a good carpenter, a good designer, a good uh, good soil and so on and so forth to build a very nice building. The historian is that architect. He imagines that building, he constructs that building in his imagination. But he cannot become a plumber or a mason or a carpenter. Carpenters are important. Let them do their job. We will use what they supply to us. It is not the shipbuilder's job to go into the details of these things. The shipbuilder's job is to design the ship. Then the other experts have to be used, their expertise. So history writing is a collective effort that way. It is not only the historian's job, like all subjects for that matter, not only history. All subjects are written like that. I mean, no economist can function without a historian or a sociologist or an anthropologist or a statistician or a geographer for that matter. In fact, there was a very nice film, The Dig, which was based on a true story about an archaeological find, just a few months before the Second World War in England, in which an amateur archaeologist did pioneering work, who was now being mentioned about that ship which was found, which actually predates, some of the archaeological dates and so on in England. He says, okay, this ship is not of the Viking period; it's of an Anglo-Saxon period, which is older than the Viking period. Now, he very clearly says, you have to roam the fields. You have to know the peasants. They will tell you the nature of the soil. Unless you know the nature of the soil, you will not be able to dig, because you may actually end up in an accident which might claim your life unless you know the nature of the soil. And who knows the nature of the soil better than the farmer who tills the soil there? So, we must follow the teachings of Mark Bloch, E.H. Carr, and other people in practicing our craft.
Uh, Quite correct, Anirudh. Professor Mishra, let me just inform you that very soon we are going to have a lecture. We will be announcing it shortly on history and literature. So don't worry, that is one of the aspects which we would be covering. The next question, I think, is by Leher Zaidi, and Leher asks, the relationship with Shah Alam and Marathas is beautiful, mentioned extensively in Julia Kay's book on Begum Samru, along with Shivaji's well known secular composition of his army and Darbar. Could you shed some light on it?
I've already mentioned these things earlier, so there is nothing, I mean, uh, you know, words like beautiful, vibrant, and so on do not have any role in a historian's description of things. These are all, beautiful, vibrant, romantic. These are phrases which come to history from literature. Whether it was we are not talking of a film relationship between Shah Alam and Marathas, which is beautiful. Please try to understand that. Shah Alam had his own compulsions. The Marathas had become very powerful. They could not be ignored. So Shah Alam was left with no choice but to, entertain the Marathas. So let's be very, very careful. Power plays a very important role in history. The state plays a very important role in history. Mm, and I would say, again, you are saying secular composition. This secular composition is a dangerous term to use. I would say that a medieval Indian ruler would enlist soldiers from any denomination, provided those soldiers were willing and committed to fight for him. Whether that makes the army secular or not, I don't know. So these are terms I would use with great circumspection. You look at Kanoji Angre, Kanoji Angre used to employ everybody. भाई जो तलवार का धनी है वो काम कर सकता है. तो उनके लिए पोर्चुगीज भी लड़ रहे हैं, यूरोपियन डेजर्टर्स भी लड़ रहे हैं, डच भी लड़ रहे हैं, कोहलीज भी लड़ रहे हैं, मराठे भी हर किस्म के लोग उनके लिए लड़ रहे हैं, क्योंकि वो अच्छी तनख्वाह देते थे, वक्त पे तनख्वाह देते थे और उनको फैसिलिटीज देते थे. तो ये सब चीजें इस बात पे निर्भर करती थी कि आप वक्त पे तनख्वाह दे रहे हैं नहीं दे रहे हैं, आप मतलब उनको इज्जत देते नहीं देते, आप उनके उनके रीति रिवाजों में दखल. उन दिनों तो खैर रीति रिवाजों में दखल देने का मतलब ही नहीं बनता था, सब लोग अपने अपने रीति रिवाज मान के चलते थे. आज भी फौज में ऐसे ही होता है, अलग अलग कम्युनिटीज के लोग अपने अपनी रीति रिवाज मान के चलते हैं, या सभी जगह होता है. तो इसका कोई मतलब सेक्युलर कॉम्पोजिशन जैसी चीज से कोई लेना देना नहीं. यू हैव टू बी वेरी केयरफुल इन द यूज ऑफ दीज टर्म्स. ये जो ब्यूटीफुल रिलेशनशिप वगैरह है ना, आई थिंक वी शुड लीव इट टू सिनेमा एंड लिटरेचर एंड दोस थिंग्स लाइक दैट. आई एम सॉरी टू
Well,
डिसअपॉइंट यू, आई मीन.
uh, I think Anirudh, I would like to once again thank you um, for a beautiful lecture
My
uh,
pleasure.
through which at least I, learned a lot. I know there are many more comments and questions, but we would probably end here because I have certain stupid queries of my own.
No, no, no.
And
You're being
well,
ultra modest, I must say. You're being
no,
very
not
modest.
at all, sir. This is not my field, but whatever I was able to hear from you, you've very lucidly informed us about the nature of sources, Maratha sources, which we get. You talked about Bakhars, and you also told us that Sir Jadunath Sarkar took them as gossip.
Yeah,
Uh,
he's
mm,
on. You can
so,
actually one can quote him. I mean, he's on record having said that.
yes,
These are
yes. In fact,
collections of gossips and fables.
Jadunath Sarkar is on record calling
Mm.
Manuchi a gossiper,
Yeah,
gossiping Manuchi, and ultimately he was proved wrong. As you
yeah.
rightly pointed out, that Bakhars are not at all gossip; they are very serious type of source material. They are the kafiyat, which gave us much information, just like Manuchi, who gives us much information. You talked about the patres, you talked about the daftars, you talked about the charitras. I wish there was enough time for us to discuss more of the charitras that you were able to do today. Then you mentioned in some detail the Pawadas, the ballads, which were composed by the Maratha balladeers. In fact, you also mentioned Lavanyas. I was just reminded of the Lavanya community of Rajasthan, who were the bardic singers, who were
Yes,
also,
the word is similar. Lavani comes
yeah,
from. Yeah.
they were also, I mean, they still perform in tamashas, and
Yes.
they tell us stories about their patrons who gave them. And as you rightly pointed out, the Lavanyas were those who were composing these type of tamashas, these kinds of poetries in a military setup, entertaining as well as even giving that feeling of whatever you call patriotism or something to the soldiers to keep on fighting for the Maratha lords. You talked about another thing, Thailis, which you mentioned. There was one thing which I was waiting for, but somehow missed getting that. Uh, I was wondering, in Rajasthani sources and even in Persian sources, there is a very strong category known as Wakai, the news reports. uh,
Vakya.
uh,
Mm.
Vakayat or Vakai.
Uh.
We have the Vakai Ranthambore Ajmer. I
Mm.
mean, for example, Emma Thoroughly used the Vakai Ajmer to debunk some of the theories of Jadunath Sarkar as far as the Rathors are concerned. Just given an example, very authentic type of source material which is there for the Mughals vis-a-vis the Rajputs. Is there anything akin to these Vakais as far as the Maratha sources are concerned? That was my query number one. Secondly, Anirudh, I would be interested to know if at all there was any difference between the nature of sources as you proceed in time. Say, nature of the Maratha sources of the 17th century. Does the nature change when we come to 18th century and so on and so forth? Or are the nature of the sources almost similar and there is a continuity? Thirdly, any difference between the those Maratha sources which are written down in Marathi and those sources which probably you might not have studied much, those Marathi sources which were penned down in Persian. Because we do find elsewhere that when the same scribe is noting down, or the same lot of people are writing on the same document, the Persian information in Persian is a slightly different from that which is being written, say, for example, in Rajasthan. So, is there any difference between the Persian and Marathi documents of the Marathas? So, these are the
You,
three queries
you,
which I would like to ask you.
there is no exact parallel of the Vakaya, Vakai literature produced in the north, historical literature produced in the north. But I would say roughly the Bakhars. You have about more 200 Bakhars there. Bakhars would be, somewhat similar to this because they are very descriptive. They describe events, they describe places, they can describe vegetation, crops, people, place names. So it's like a vrittant, a narrative of things in general. So that would be roughly equal to that. As far as the Persian sources, as far as the Persian sources are concerned, you're absolutely right. There was, in fact, in the early part of the 20th century, and in fact, from the late 19th century onwards, there was a conscious attempt by Maharashtrian intellectuals, especially the historically minded intellectuals, the historians, the entire school. I mean, you have about 30, 40 important names. You have Khare, you have Persanes, and all these people in that. There, and these are mentioned very important sources. They would they also got into the act of translating Persian accounts into Marathi. So you have important Persian accounts of the 18th century and earlier being translated into Marathi and being presented to the Marathi reading audience. And I am sure in the process of translation they may have undergone some modification. But one will have to really go into details of this and have a look at it. It is a different project. It's a separate project altogether. One will have to see the original Persian account and then see the translated account and then see the possible metamorphoses which this original Persian account undergoes into in being translated into Marathi. So you have these things, and there was a large give and take between the North and the Deccan in the 18th century. As far as the nature of sources is concerned, let me just add a couple of things. In the 18th century, the sources become copious, far more copious than they are in the 17th century. And in the 18th century, the number of Bakhars being produced is much larger. The number of Pawadas and Lavanes being produced is much, much larger in the 18th century. In fact, many of the Pawada writers were living in the latter half of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century. They were producing a large amount of work. uh, Administration becomes larger, especially because the Marathas then expand. Once they expand, the historical process itself produces a large amount of material. So you have more material coming from Gujarat, more material coming from Odisha, more material coming from Bengal, more material coming from North India, regular letters coming from Delhi, regular letters coming from Gwalior, and so on and so forth. So this is really 18th century is the it really sees the flowering, the expansion and the flowering of Maratha power in the 18th century. So even under Shivaji, I would say, even after Shivaji became Chhatrapati, the field of operations remained largely Maharashtra. They didn't go beyond that. It's in the 18th century that the expansion really took place. So obviously the records became more copious. For instance, the Angre family records, and most of the important family daftars were produced in the 18th century, and most of the important admiralty records were produced in the 18th century. This is the time when the Maratha Navy is active. So as the administrative activity, the what is called military fiscalism began to grow, as administrative activities began to grow, as military campaigns actually started ranging over much larger areas than they had earlier, the number of sources, the letters, for instance, in the 18th century are much, the patre, the letters in the 18th century are far more, they form a much bigger corpus than they would in the 16th or the 17th or the earlier century. So certainly there is an expansion of sources, and a tremendous expansion of the sources in the 18th century, which becomes the Peshwa Daftar, which is a very humongous, large archive of records of that period.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you very much. It was really a very informative lecture. There are many other questions, but I think we can send them to Anirudh to answer, and he may answer them at ease because we have taken enough of his time. Let me inform those who are watching us that we would be having Anirudh with us once again after some time, a few lectures afterwards. He'll be with us once again with another very scintillating theme. We would wait for him till then. Day after tomorrow, that is on Sunday, we would be having a very interesting lecture by Professor Asim Siddiqui. He is not a historian. He is a professor of English, and he would be speaking on literature as a window for history. So we would be having Professor Asim Siddiqui, who would be talking about the relationship between literature and history on the coming Sunday, that is 7th of March.
At the same
Uh,
time,
Same time, same channel. Uh, Apart from that, I mean, usually we have only these two lectures per week, on one on Friday and one on Sunday, and that too is, I know, quite taxing for all of you who have to join us twice a week and devote your time. But I hope that you people would be gaining from this. I know that today I have written a post on Facebook saying that when pandemic broke, suddenly there was, this surfeit of online lectures going on, everyone delivering lectures. We also started, but I really want to thank you that through your cooperations, our lectures have been well attended, and I think that serious historians have tried to give you something which is thought provocative. uh, but on Monday, that is 8th of March, we have the Women's Day, which is celebrated all over the world. And so we decided that we would have a special program on Monday. That is, Monday would mean 8th of March. And on 8th of March, in Women's Day special, we would be we are trying to have three guests, all from Delhi. Uh, we have requested Professor Farhat Hassan to be there. He won't be speaking much, but he would be moderating the talk. I have requested him to moderate the talk. Uh, uh, and the two speakers who would be, and the topic, the general topic is recovering women's agency in early modern households. And the two respective speakers are Dr. Seher Khwaja from Delhi University and Dr. Priyanka Khanna. Dr. Khwaja would be speaking on imagining Mughal imperial household as a political space. So this would be her topic on which she would be giving us very crucial information. On the other hand, Dr. Priyanka Khanna would speak on marriage and concubinage in Rajput households. And after both of them have spoken, then there would be a discussion between them and with Professor Farhat Hassan. At some point of time, whenever Farhat Sahab wants, and as usual, as you all people always do, you would be putting down your questions, noting down your questions, and at the end, they would also be taken up. So this is the coming program of this week. So instead of two lectures this consecutively, we have three. Today we are thanking Professor Anirudh. On Saturday, we would be having Dr. Asim Siddiqui, and on Monday, we would have three separate guests talking about the Women's Day. Thank you very much, Anirudh. Thank you once again. Looking forward to listen to you
I
again
look forward.
in a few weeks. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Nadeem. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank